The shed was not meant to be beautiful. It was meant to be useful. Its frame rose in the kind of straightforward way things rise when built by hands that know labor but not ornament. Corrugated tin roof, rough planks plain just enough to hold together, a wide doorway meant for machines instead of guests. It stood at the far end of a gravel lane, set against a horizon where the sky stretched wide and the prairie grasses bent with a restless patience. For generations, this land had been a place of barns, fences, and sheds. To the farmer, another shed was nothing more than continuity, a tool for tending the earth the same way his father had before him. But to the neighbors who had only recently arrived, families drawn in by the glossy brochures of a gated subdivision, complete with golf carts, uniform lawns, and a pristine clubhouse, the shed was something else entirely. It was raw. It was unpolished. It was a blemish on the carefully curated symmetry of their neighborhood. The complaints began quickly, first whispered among themselves, then typed in bold into the neighborhood's online forum. Words like unsightly, nuisance, and violation of community standards found their way into threads that multiplied like weeds after a rainstorm. In those words was not only irritation but also fear. The fear that one man's practicality might devalue the delicate illusion of perfection they had purchased. By midweek, the situation escalated. An officer's patrol car pulled quietly onto the gravel road, its tires crunching against stones, polished smooth by decades of tractor treads. The officer, professional and polite, approached with paperwork in hand. He explained that the HOA had filed a complaint. An unapproved structure had been erected, and questions lingered about whether it extended onto community-owned property. The farmer stood calm, listening with the kind of silence that comes from years of weathering harder storms than paperwork. He fetched an old survey map, edges yellowed, folds softened by use. His father's faint pencil notes still ghosted along the margins, notations of creek lines, soil types, and old property divisions. The map made one thing plain. The shed stood firmly on his land. But facts alone did not matter here. Not yet. The HOA president had already posted a bulletin online, complete with a photograph of the shed taken from the worst possible angle, its shadow long, its boards appearing crooked under the distortion of the lens. Captions promised legal action and vowed that property values must be protected at all costs. Neighbors gathered that evening, clustered in manicured driveways, murmuring about how one man's shed could set precedent, how disorder began small but grew, how their investments must be guarded. Lawn sprinklers ticked in unison, sending arcs of water across green patches that drank from the farmer's very irrigation rights. Across the cul-de-sac, lights blinked on in a carefully orchestrated dance, each home shining against the twilight like pearls on a string. The farmer remained at the shed. He stood in its doorway, watching the light fade. Inside, the space smelled of fresh timber and iron tools, still waiting for the seed bins and fittings that would fill it. This structure was no rebellion, no insult. It was necessity. Yet he could feel something shifting, a tremor in the relationship between land and those who believed they owned it. The next morning, the farmer found a laminated notice fixed to his gate with zip ties. It bore his name, his parcel number, and an accusation. His shed had encroached upon the common buffer zone. That buffer, a thin strip of land mapped with careless lines by developers years earlier, now became the HOA's weapon. The document demanded compliance within 30 days. The farmer removed the notice carefully, smoothed it flat, and laid it on his workbench. He placed a heavy iron wrench on its corner so the breeze wouldn't carry it away. The paper sat there like an omen, daring him to acknowledge the storm gathering at his threshold. This was not simply about a shed. It was about control, about power, about who truly commanded the soil beneath the carefully painted fences. For while the HOA believed they could police aesthetics and enforce rules, they did not yet understand the depth of his ownership. They did not know that the deeds he held went further, deeper, and older than their community covenants. They did not know that while they claimed dominion over appearances, he owned the ground itself, acre after acre, tied to him by legal threads spun decades before the subdivision even existed. Still, he did not yet reveal this truth. He chose patience. He chose to watch and wait, letting their confidence swell. In that waiting, he remembered his father's words. Land never argues. It only waits for others to show whether they belong to it. That evening, as the sun lowered behind the horizon and cast the fields in a burnished glow, the farmer locked the shed door. He could feel eyes on him, neighbors peering from their porches, phones in hand, documenting his every move as though he were an intruder in their pristine world. The shed stood silent, unbothered by gossip or regulations. The farmer knew the fight was not about lumber or nails, but about heritage colliding with illusion. And as night settled in, he sensed that the first strike had been made, not by him, but by those who underestimated just how deeply the land itself was on his side. The neighborhood had not always looked this way. Before the rows of houses, before the fences and mailboxes, there were wide fields and open skies. The land stretched without boundaries, filled with wheat, corn, and cattle. It was the farmer's inheritance, passed down from his father and his grandfather before him. When the developers arrived, they brought maps, contracts, and promises. They spoke of a modern community with perfect lawns, shining streetlights, and a safe clubhouse for families. They persuaded the farmer's father to sell part of the land, and soon a subdivision rose from the soil, but not all of the land was sold. The farmer's family kept large pieces of it, especially the parts tied to water rights and old easements that most people forgot existed. The new residents never thought about this. To them, the farmer was just a leftover piece of the past. His boots were muddy, his fences were plain, and now his shed stood out like a scar against their carefully planned streets. What they called ugly was to him simply practical, but their anger grew quickly, and soon it turned into something more. One evening, the farmer received a notice demanding he attend an HOA meeting. The letter spoke of violations, community rules, and mandatory attendance. Inside the clubhouse, the air was sharp and polished, just like the people seated in rows of folding chairs. At the front sat Karen, the HOA president, her red blazer shining under the lights. She wasted no time. "Mr. Daniels," she began, "we're here to discuss the structure you built. It is not approved, it is unsightly, and it lowers our property values." The farmer kept his voice calm. "It's just a shed, built on my land for my work." Karen's eyes narrowed. "That land is a matter of interpretation. Our survey shows part of your shed is on the community buffer. That buffer is not yours." A man in a polo shirt spoke from the crowd. "We all paid for this neighborhood. We agreed to the rules. If one person ignores them, then everything falls apart." Another voice rose. "Today it's a shed. Tomorrow it's a junkyard. We cannot allow this." The farmer lifted his hat slightly in his hands, his words steady. "That buffer zone you're claiming. Read your deeds carefully. That land was never sold. It still belongs to me." The room fell silent. Karen leaned forward, her voice sharper. "You can't possibly believe that." The farmer met her gaze. "I don't just believe it. I can prove it." The meeting ended in anger. Neighbors muttered to each other as the farmer walked out. They saw him not as a neighbor but as a threat. The HOA board gathered after he left, already planning their next move. Back home, the farmer spread his old documents across the kitchen table. Survey maps, easement papers, and water rights agreements lay side by side. His father's handwriting still marked the margins, notes from decades ago when the land was first divided. These documents were his shield. They told a story older than the HOA, older than the houses, older than the clubhouse where Karen now ruled. But for now, he kept them close, waiting for the right moment. He knew their anger would only grow. The next days proved him right. More warning letters arrived. Brightly colored notices were nailed to his fence. Neighbors stopped waving when they saw him. Instead, they raised their phones to take pictures of the shed, hoping to gather evidence. What was once just wood and tin had become a symbol. To him, it was nothing but storage. To them, it was rebellion. One evening, just as the sun was sinking low and the sky turned red, Karen appeared at his gate. She stood tall, her arms crossed, her face full of confidence. "You're forcing our hand, Daniels," she said coldly. "We've been patient. If you don't remove that shed, we'll take you to court. We'll bring the county, the police, whoever it takes." The farmer's reply was quiet but firm. "Do what you have to do. I'm not moving it." Karen smirked. "Then don't blame us for what comes next." She turned sharply and walked away, heels clicking against the gravel. The farmer stayed by the gate, watching her silhouette vanish against the fading light. He knew she underestimated him. She thought he was just a stubborn old man clinging to the past. But he had something she didn't: ownership, history, and patience. That night, inside the shed, he sat on a wooden stool. The air was cool, smelling of pine and dust. He thought of his father, of all the work that had gone into keeping the land alive. He thought of the neighbors, so certain that rules and fines could bend everything to their will. He felt the weight pressing on him. He wanted peace, not conflict, but the fight was no longer about a simple shed. It was about who truly controlled the land beneath their feet. The notices stacked on his workbench looked flimsy compared to the old deeds on his table. Their papers were temporary. His were permanent. Their rules lasted a few years. His family's rights had lasted generations. Still, he whispered into the stillness of the shed, "Not yet, but soon." The next morning a patrol car rolled up again. This time county inspectors stepped out with clipboards in hand. They measured the shed, snapped photographs, and muttered to each other. Across the street, neighbors gathered like spectators at a show, arms folded, faces eager. They watched every movement, certain that the farmer would finally be defeated. The farmer stood by the shed door, silent. His face gave away nothing. He let them take their measurements, let them write their notes. Deep down he knew what they did not. The land was still his. Their rules were about to collapse under the weight of truth. And when the right moment came, the shed would not be a violation. It would be the spark that revealed who truly owned everything. By nightfall the neighborhood was buzzing with rumors. People said the county was preparing to fine him. Others claimed the shed would be torn down. Karen posted online that the HOA would win this battle no matter what. The farmer sat at his kitchen table. The old documents still spread before him. He traced his finger along the boundary lines, the easements, the signatures that tied the land to his name. The storm was coming closer. He could feel it, but he also knew something the others did not. They had already lost. They just didn't know it yet. The conflict with the HOA was no longer just about wood and nails. It had become something deeper, something that pulled at the farmer's heart and memory. The shed was the surface, but beneath it ran a story of blood, sweat, and the bond between a man and his land. Every evening when the voices of the neighborhood died down and the sprinklers hissed like serpents in the distance, the farmer sat inside the shed and thought. He remembered his father, a man who believed that land was not just soil but family. His father had always said, "A man without land is like a tree without roots." Those words echoed now, heavy with truth. The farmhouse that still stood beside the fields carried marks of generations. Scratches on the doorway showed where children once grew taller. Faded paint on the barn doors told of storms endured. And on the mantel inside the house sat black and white photographs. His father leaning against a tractor, his mother hanging clothes in the wind, his grandfather standing in front of the very creek that now flowed beneath the subdivision. The farmer looked at those pictures often. They reminded him that his fight was not about pride. It was about respect. Respect for the people who had built a life on this soil long before the HOA ever existed. Each photograph felt like a witness, urging him not to bend. The shed was new, but it stood on the same principle that had guided his family for generations. Survival through work, not through appearances. Still, the struggle wore on him. The days felt long, and the nights were filled with silence heavier than usual. His neighbors no longer greeted him. Instead, they turned away, their curtains pulled tight. He had become the villain in their story, the outsider they wanted gone. One night, sitting on his porch, he whispered into the darkness, "Am I wrong for holding on? Am I the fool here? The land did not answer in words, but the steady song of crickets and the whisper of the wind across the fields reminded him he was not alone. He had the earth beneath him, the sky above him, and the memory of his family within him. It was on a Saturday morning, while repairing a fence, that a voice called out from across the road, "Mr. Daniels." He turned to see a young man, one of the newer residents perhaps in his 30s, walking hesitantly toward him. His clothes were casual, not the polished kind the others wore to HOA meetings. The man stopped a few feet away. "I just wanted to say, not everyone here agrees with what they're doing. Some of us think it's gone too far." The farmer studied him for a moment. "Then why don't you speak up?" The young man shifted uncomfortably. "Because people are afraid. Karen runs this HOA like it's her own kingdom. Nobody wants to be her next target." The farmer nodded, not surprised. "Fear has deep roots." The man glanced at the shed. "For what it's worth, I don't think it's ugly. Reminds me of where I grew up." With that, he walked away, leaving the farmer with a flicker of something he hadn't felt in weeks. That small moment stayed with him. It reminded him that beneath the polished houses and painted fences, these were still people, people with their own stories, their own fears, their own memories. They were not his enemies by nature. They were caught in the trap of appearances, led by someone who thrived on control. The farmer began to see them differently. The couple who walked their dog past his field were not just complainers. They were parents trying to protect what they thought was safe. The older man who scowled at him from across the street was not just a critic. He was a retiree who had put his savings into a home and feared losing value. They all feared something. And fear, he realized, was the bridge between them. The HOA expected him to argue, to shout, to lash out, but he did not. He chose silence. He let them post their notices. He let them take their photographs. His calm unsettled them, more than anger ever could. At another HOA meeting, Karen raised her voice. "He ignores us because he thinks he's above us. He thinks he's untouchable." But the farmer simply said, "I ignore nothing. I listen, and I wait." The room bristled with frustration. They could not understand how a man could stand so firm without showing fear. His silence became a weapon. It was not the silence of weakness, but of confidence. It told them that something heavier was waiting beneath the surface. Yet, alone at night, he felt the weight. He was strong, but he was also human. The accusations, the stares, the endless pressure, it all pressed down like stones. He would sit by the shed, lantern glowing faintly, and wonder, how long can one man stand against many? How long before patience runs out? But each time doubt crept in, he would hear his father's voice in memory. The land always knows its true owner. Stand with it, and it will stand with you. And so he did. Karen's new threat. One morning, as he checked his mailbox, he found a new letter. This one was harsher than the rest. It threatened immediate legal action, heavy fines, and even the possibility of forced removal of his shed. At the bottom, signed in bold, was Karen's name. That evening, she appeared at his gate again. Her tone was sharp. "You think you're clever, Daniels, but we're done waiting. Next week, this matter goes to court, and when it does, you'll regret ever crossing us." The farmer looked at her calmly. "We'll see who regrets what." For the first time, Karen's expression flickered. She saw something in his eyes that unsettled her, a certainty she could not explain. That night, the farmer spread the old documents out once more. He traced the maps, the easements, the signatures. Each page felt like a voice from the past, telling him he was not standing alone. He thought of his neighbors, their fears, their doubts, their anger. He thought of the young man who had quietly supported him. And he realized that this battle was not only his. It was about showing the truth, not just for himself, but for everyone trapped in Karen's illusion of power. The emotional bridge had been built. On one side stood his past, his family, his heritage. On the other stood his neighbors, blinded by fear. And in between, he was the only one who could reveal the truth that connected them all. The week ahead would not be quiet. The HOA had prepared their case, convinced they would crush him in court. Karen spoke loudly, her confidence like a drumbeat, telling everyone victory was near. But inside the farmer's shed, beneath the lantern light, a quiet fire grew. He was ready. He had the deeds, the rights, the history. And soon, when the time came, the truth would shatter the false walls of power that the HOA had built. The land was not theirs. It never had been. And when the courtroom doors opened, everyone would finally see who the real owner was. The day of the court hearing arrived, and the tension in the community had reached its peak. From early morning, neighbors gathered in small groups outside the courthouse, whispering, speculating, and watching the farmer with guarded eyes. Some came out of curiosity, others out of anger, and a few came simply because they were afraid of what the truth might reveal. The building itself felt heavier than usual, its stone walls holding the weight of all the secrets that were about to surface. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with noise. The benches were filled with residents, board members, and reporters who had heard about the strange conflict between a single farmer and the homeowners association that claimed authority over him. The air was thick with anticipation. Karen sat in the front row, her red blazer pressed neatly, her expression calm but her eyes sharp with confidence. She had told everyone that this would be the end of the farmer's stubbornness. She believed the HOA would prove their dominance once and for all. The farmer entered quietly. His steps were slow, but steady, as if he had walked this path 100 times before. He carried only a worn folder, thick with documents that had weathered decades. His expression was calm, his presence unshaken by the stares that followed him across the room. To many he seemed out of place in his boots and plain clothes, but to him, this was simply another part of tending the land. The judge called the case, and the HOA's attorney stood first. His voice was loud and sharp, echoing through the room. He spoke of rules, of community standards, of promises made to protect property values. He described the shed as an intrusion, an eyesore, and a violation that threatened the harmony of the neighborhood. Every word he spoke was accompanied by a glance at Karen, who nodded firmly, her confidence radiating as though the outcome were already written. The neighbors leaned forward in their seats, nodding along, their expressions eager. They wanted to see the farmer defeated, wanted proof that their HOA's rules could not be ignored. For them, this was not just about a shed. It was about order, about the safety of conformity, about the illusion that their lives could remain untouched by anything beyond their control. When the attorney finished, the judge turned to the farmer. For a long moment, the room was silent. Then the farmer rose, opened his folder, and began to speak. His words were quiet, but each one carried weight. He explained that the shed was built on his own land, not on the HOA's common property. He presented survey maps, old and new, showing the boundaries with clarity. He laid out easement agreements and water rights, documents signed long before the subdivision was even a thought. Each paper told a story, each line of ink tied back to a time when the land was raw and unbroken. At first, the audience shifted restlessly. They whispered that it was a trick, that the papers were outdated, that none of it mattered anymore. Karen smirked, certain the judge would brush it aside. But then the farmer unfolded the final document, a deed so old its edges were yellowed, yet still legally binding. It showed clearly that while the houses had been built, while the lawns had been laid out, the ownership of the land beneath them had never fully left his family. The HOA managed appearances, but the soil, the water, and the foundation still belonged to him. The courtroom fell silent. The attorney's confident tone crumbled as he stammered over objections that carried no strength. Karen's eyes widened, her confidence breaking like glass under pressure. She rose from her seat, her voice sharp. "This is impossible. We paid for this land. We own our homes. We are the rightful authority here." The farmer looked at her calmly. His voice was steady. "You bought houses, Karen, but the ground beneath them, the earth itself, was never yours. You live on land that still belongs to me." Gasps rippled across the room. Some neighbors looked at each other in disbelief. Others looked down at their laps, unable to meet his eyes. The judge leaned forward, studying the documents carefully, his brow furrowed as he traced the old lines of ink. At last he leaned back and spoke. His voice was calm, but firm. The evidence is clear. The shed stands on Mr. Daniels' property. The HOA has no authority to demand its removal. Furthermore, the documents confirm extended rights to land under this community. The complaint is dismissed. The gavel struck, and the sound cracked through the silence like thunder. Karen's composure shattered. She stood quickly, pointing at the farmer with trembling hands. "You can't do this. You can't hold this power over all of us. This is a trick. It has to be a trick." But her words echoed hollow in the wooden chamber. The residents now stared at her, some with anger, others with shame. For years, she had claimed control, but in a single morning, her authority had been broken. The farmer gathered his documents, slipping them back into the folder with deliberate calm. He said nothing more. He did not need to. The truth had spoken louder than any argument. He walked out of the courtroom. Each step measured, leaving behind a community forever changed. Outside, the air felt lighter. The sky stretched endlessly, and the fields beyond the courthouse whispered in the wind. Reporters rushed forward, asking questions, but the farmer only shook his head and continued walking. He had no interest in fame or spectacle. His only interest was the land, the shed, and the quiet work that would continue long after the voices faded. Back in the neighborhood, things would never be the same. The residents now knew the ground beneath them was not theirs in the way they had believed. Some were afraid, wondering what power the farmer might use against them. Others felt a quiet respect, realizing they had misjudged him. And Karen, humiliated, burned with anger as she plotted her next move, refusing to accept defeat. But the balance of power had shifted. The HOA could no longer hide behind rules and threats. The truth had stripped them bare, and the farmer had shown, without raising his voice, that ownership was not about appearances, but about history, law, and patience. The rising tension had reached its peak, and the entire neighborhood stood on the edge of change. The shed, once mocked as ugly and out of place, had become the symbol of something far greater. It was no longer just wood and tin. It was proof. The farmer returned home that evening, the gravel crunching under his boots. He stood by the shed, watching the sun set across the fields, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold. For the first time in weeks, he felt the weight lift slightly from his shoulders. The battle was far from over, but he had shown the truth. And now, the entire community had to live with it. The court ruling sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. By evening, the online forum was burning with posts, questions, and accusations. Screens lit up across the subdivision, as residents tried to understand what had just happened. Some demanded explanations from the HOA board, while others quietly admitted they had never really known how much control the farmer actually had. Karen, however, refused to accept defeat. She paced inside the clubhouse late into the night, her voice sharp as she called emergency meetings, her hands trembling as she sent message after message. "We can't let him win," she hissed into the phone, though no one on the other end could calm her fury. Her perfect facade had cracked, and the revelation of the land's true ownership gnawed at her like fire under glass. The farmer, meanwhile, sat quietly at his kitchen table. His folder of documents lay closed before him, the papers neatly stacked as though the storm had never touched them. He poured himself a cup of black coffee, watching the steam rise. He had expected resistance, but he had not expected the entire community to finally see the truth so plainly. The revelation had been forced into the open. There was no going back. By the next morning, small groups of neighbors began appearing at his gate. Some stood awkwardly, unsure whether to speak, while others knocked politely, asking questions. One couple, nervous but honest, finally approached him. "We didn't know," the husband admitted. His hands shook slightly as he spoke. "We thought the HOA had control. That's what we were told when we bought the house." The farmer nodded. His voice was calm. You bought your home, and that's yours. But the land underneath? That's mine. It's been that way since my grandfather's time. The wife's eyes widened. So, what does that mean for us? For everyone here? It means, the farmer said slowly, that the HOA has less power than they claim. Their rules don't override ownership. They can't tell me what to do on land that belongs to me. And now, you all know the truth. Word spread quickly. Some residents grew angry, feeling betrayed by the board. Others grew fearful, wondering if the farmer might someday use his ownership to take more than just respect. The neighborhood, once united in its illusion of perfection, was suddenly fractured. Karen doubled down. At the next HOA gathering, she stood before a smaller but still loyal crowd. Her voice raised. Don't be fooled by his tricks. He's using old papers to scare us. He wants to control everything, to make us bend to his will. We must resist. But her words fell differently now. Doubt had crept in. A man at the back raised his hand. But the judge said the papers were real. That means we've been lied to. Karen's smile wavered, though she tried to hold it steady. The judge can be wrong. We can appeal. We must appeal. Another voice cut through. And what if he's right? What if the land was never ours to begin with? The room grew restless. Karen banged her fist on the table, but her control had slipped. The unexpected revelation had already spread too far, shaking the foundation of her authority. For the farmer, the revelation was more than a victory. It was a turning point. The neighbors now looked at him differently, some with respect, others with fear. He walked the gravel lane, and people stopped whispering long enough to greet him. Hesitant, but genuine. The young man who had once quietly supported him approached again, his voice low. They're scared now. Karen's losing her grip. People are starting to realize she doesn't have as much power as she claimed. The farmer studied the man's face, seeing not just fear but also hope. Fear can control people, he said, but truth breaks chains faster than anger ever will. The man nodded. Maybe now they'll listen to you. The farmer shook his head. I don't want them to listen to me. I want them to listen to the land. That's what matters. But the HOA was not finished. Within days, Karen called for another inspection. This time, she demanded the county review not just the shed, but every inch of the property surrounding it. Inspectors arrived with maps, drones, and cameras, walking the perimeter as residents watched nervously. The farmer stood nearby, his arms folded. You'll find nothing new, he said calmly. The boundaries are the same as they've always been. Karen sneered. We'll see about that. We'll expose every loophole you've used to twist this in your favor. But as the inspectors worked, their findings only confirmed the truth. The shed was lawful. The land rights were undeniable. And in a final twist, they uncovered something the farmer already knew but had never needed to reveal. An unbroken chain of ownership that tied not just the buffer zone, but key community spaces, including the pond and the playground, to his name. The revelation stunned everyone. The pond, the walking trails, even the patch of land the clubhouse sat on were technically leased from his family. It had all been overlooked in the rush of development, buried in contracts nobody had cared to read. And now, in the light of day, the truth was plain. The neighborhood belonged to him more than anyone had imagined. The reaction was explosive. Parents panicked, whispering about whether their children's playground could be taken away. Others feared their mortgages were built on shaky ground. The HOA board scrambled, holding late-night meetings, desperately trying to spin the story in their favor. But the damage was done. Karen's control was slipping through her fingers like sand. Some residents began coming to the farmer directly, asking if they could lease parts of land, asking if they could work with him instead of against him. He listened patiently, never raising his voice, never making promises he could not keep. For years he had been ignored and dismissed. Now the same people who had mocked his shed were looking to him for stability. The farmer, though, felt the weight of this unexpected power. He had not built the shed to control anyone. He had not fought the HOA to humiliate them. All he had wanted was space to work, space to store tools and seed, space to continue the quiet labor of his family. But now, by simply standing firm, he had revealed a truth that turned the neighborhood upside down. Late at night, sitting by the shed, he spoke softly into the darkness. "I didn't ask for this, but maybe the land has its own way of reminding people who it belongs to." The shed glowed faintly under the moonlight, no longer just a structure of tin and wood, but a symbol. To some it was a reminder of their mistakes. To others, it was proof that truth outlasts illusion. To the farmer it was simply what it had always been, a tool for work, built on ground that would always be his. Karen, however, was not finished. The humiliation of defeat burned in her like fire. She plotted, whispered with lawyers, and promised her loyal followers that the battle was not over. But deep inside, she knew the revelation had broken something she could never repair. Her authority had been built on control, on fear, on the belief that the HOA's rules were stronger than any individual. Now the farmer had shown that the foundation of her power was nothing more than sand. And the unexpected revelation still echoed through every corner of the neighborhood. They lived not on her rules, but on his land. The storm had broken, and the air was different now. The courtroom battle had ended, and the unexpected revelation had spread through every street, every house, every conversation in the neighborhood. No one could ignore it anymore. The farmer's ownership was undeniable, and the shed, the ugly shed that had sparked the war, stood stronger than ever, its walls weathered but proud. The community had been shaken to its core. At first, there was panic. Rumors twisted like vines through the online forums. Some whispered that the farmer would reclaim their lawns, that he would demand rent for every foot of land. Others feared their mortgages were worthless, that their investments had been built on lies. For weeks, fear was louder than reason. But over time, something else began to grow. Respect. Slowly, neighbors started to realize the truth was not their enemy. The farmer had not tried to take their homes, nor had he demanded anything beyond his right to live and work on the land his family had always owned. The more they thought about it, the more they saw the difference between Karen's control and the farmer's quiet strength. Karen, however, could not accept it. Her power had been humiliated publicly, and her voice lost its authority. She continued to hold HOA meetings, but fewer and fewer people came. The red blazer she once wore like armor now looked more like a costume. Neighbors who had once feared her now avoided her, embarrassed by their loyalty to someone who had misled them. In the end, her voice was drowned out by silence, her leadership reduced to nothing but a memory. The farmer carried on with his life. He repaired fences, tended his fields, and worked inside the shed that had started it all. But something had changed within him as well. He felt the weight of what the land meant, not just to him, but to everyone around him. It was not just soil and grass, it was history, it was truth, it was power, and with that power came responsibility. One evening, a group of neighbors came to his gate. They were not angry this time. Their voices were softer, their faces tired. The young man who had once spoken quietly in his defense stood at the front. "We came to ask you something," he said. "Not about the shed, about the future. We know the HOA doesn't hold the power it claimed. We know the land belongs to you, but we want to live in peace. We want our families to feel safe here. Can we find a way forward together?" The farmer looked at them for a long moment, then nodded. "I don't want control over your lives. I never did. I just wanted the right to build on my land. You have your homes, and those will always be yours. The ground beneath? It's mine. Yes, but I will never use it to harm you. What I ask is respect. Respect for the land, and for the truth." Relief spread across their faces. For the first time in months, there was no tension, no accusations, no threats. There was understanding. From that day forward, the neighborhood changed. The HOA's grip dissolved, replaced by something quieter but stronger: cooperation. The residents no longer whispered about the farmer as an outsider. Instead, They began to see him as the foundation they had overlooked. He became not just the man with the shed, but the man whose patience had saved them from illusions. The shed itself gained new meaning. Where once it was seen as ugly, now it was seen as honest. Children passed by it on their way to school, and waved. Neighbors sometimes stopped to talk with the farmer as he worked. Their tone no longer hostile, but curious. The shed had become a symbol of truth, plain, practical, unshaken by appearances. Karen, humiliated and bitter, eventually left the neighborhood. Her house, once the hub of power, stood empty for months before new owners moved in. Nobody spoke much of her after that. She had built her authority on rules and fear, and when the truth came out, it vanished like smoke in the wind. The moral of the story spread far beyond the subdivision. Reporters wrote about it, and people in other communities whispered about the farmer who had stood alone against an HOA and won. Some laughed about the ugly shed that had changed everything. Others spoke of it with reverence as a lesson in patience and truth. For the farmer, none of that mattered. What mattered was the land. He continued to walk its fields at dawn, boots pressing into soil that had carried his family for generations. He knew storms would always come. Storms of weather, storms of people, storms of change. But as long as he stood with the land, he would never stand alone. And in the quiet moments, when the world seemed still, he would rest his hand on the rough boards of the shed and remember the battle that had turned neighbors into adversaries, then into allies. The shed had begun as a simple structure for work. It had become the stage for truth, and in the end, it had left a lesson stronger than nails or wood. That appearances fade, rules shift, and power crumbles. But truth, like the land, endures.